In Chaz Palmiontari's fantastic movie A Bronx Tale, Robert De Niro's character offers a pearl of motivational wisdom. There's nothing sadder in life than wasted talent. And make no mistake, the heavyweight division is littered with talent. And yet many of these fantastic fighters who would have been brilliant by any standard in any era seem unwilling to take certain risks that will enable them to be cloaked in the garments of glory and have their names echoing in the annals of time. And one could argue that that in itself is an example of wasted talent. Anthony Joshua in a recent interview was saying, we're not fighting regularly enough. Us fighters, we're getting treated too well. Now don't get me wrong, there are some risk takers in the heavyweight division. Guys like Joe Joyce, Zhang, Dillian Whyte, they have taken risks throughout the course of their career in order to catapult themselves from B status fighters to A status fighters. You see, one of the biggest problems we have in the division is the fact that a lot of B rated guys are not willing to overcome other B rated guys. They want to beat C and D level guys and sit around after their promoters have maybe earned them a nice little spot on the rankings, hoping that they get a mandatory shot at the big time. And we're going to get to that in a moment. But one of the champions that certainly does also deserve an awful lot of props is Alexander Usyk. This is a man who has been on the road his entire career, taken risk after risk, and established himself as the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the sport. Now, in the most recent negotiations against Tyson Fury, I was saying how I felt the 70-30 he demanded at the final obstacle was unrealistic. The fight was never going to get over the line with that sort of demand. And that shook a lot of people up. A lot of people were upset. I'm simply talking about what was realistic. But I also explained that, in my opinion, it was a matter of principle for Usyk, because there's no doubt that he did jump through hoops early in the negotiations to do his utmost to make the fight happen. And whilst maybe Scales' challenge were looming towards the end of negotiations, he might have thought to himself, you know what, this guy's messing me around, I'm going to go for the better financial options, and I can't blame him for that. If he's thinking, I'm not getting this fight anyway, and I do not believe that Tyson Fury wanted to make that fight at that time for whatever reason, then who can blame Alexander Usyk? The fact of the matter is, these guys are risk takers. But there are too many fighters who are not necessarily like that. Tyson Fury had built up a really good legacy up until 18 months ago, and it's in the process of still being a brilliant legacy. If he was to go on to beat the likes of Alexander Usyk and Anthony Joshua and maybe Andy Ruiz, and then he retired from the sport, his legacy would be superb. His CV would be brilliant. So he's in the process. But in the last 18 months, what we've seen from Fury is simply not acceptable to hardcore boxing fans. To fight Derek Chisora and then to fight Francis Ngannou is just not something any of us want to see. And on top of that, we're now seeing a one-way rematch clause being put into this contract. I mean, what is the logic behind that? Well, the logic is that Tyson Fury is a brand. And if he was to lose to Francis Ngannou, where does he go from there? Sure, the belt won't be on the line. He'll still be champion. But the people will know he's not the legitimate best heavyweight in the world anymore. He just lost to Francis Ngannou, who could go on to fight Deontay Wilder or Anthony Joshua or whoever else. So it's a protection of the brand. It is a weaponization of a rematch clause in order to protect a financial asset. This is something we saw with Anthony Joshua. In the most recent negotiations, Dillian Whyte had made concession after concession, and the only area that he was not willing to concede on was the one-way rematch clause. He planted his feet and he was not moving from that. And that rematch clause was only taken out after it emerged that AJ would reportedly be fighting Wilder regardless of the outcome of the fight against Dillian Whyte. Well, what is the purpose of having a rematch clause for a non-title fight? Well, the purpose is for Anthony Joshua to be able to get that bag in Saudi Arabia. So by taking away the thing you need to insure yourself against, you don't need that insurance policy. So Fury and AJ are weaponizing rematch clauses here. With AJ, you could argue that at least it's against a ranked contender in Dillian Whyte. Tyson Fury is putting in a one-way rematch clause against a guy who's never boxed before. This is a ludicrous development. Now, he was challenged about the Francis Ngannou fight on Talk Sport. Adam Cattrall had Frank Warren, his promoter, on, and he was questioning, why aren't you getting him out there against some of the contenders in a fight that we want to see? Top 10 guys like Makhmudov, guys like Frank Sanchez. And Frank Warren said, who? Do you even know what they look like? Who are these guys? And that did seem to stump Adam Catterall. Now, we know that this is an excuse because when you are in the process of legacy building, it doesn't matter whether a guy is well known. This is not a popularity contest. You need to clean out the top guys in order to remain as champion. But what is also true is that these guys, these B-level guys, are not helping themselves because it enables Frank Warren to come out with the excuse and say, we're in the business of building events. We don't care about who these random guys are. We want to make big money and big events. And that may very well be true. And I understand that. I understand that boxing is, as Steve Kim said, a business dressed as a sport. So I get that. But haven't you been telling us that Tyson Fury can sell out stadiums against anybody? He's a pay-per-view star regardless. So does it really matter whether he was to fight the likes of Frank Sanchez? So my aim here is not to somehow defend the conduct of Fury over the course of the last 18 months. He's not involved in the fights that we want to see him in. Even if you're a die-hard Tyson Fury fan, surely you want to see him in there against the best in the sport. If you think he beats all these guys, don't you want to see him prove it? So one of the areas where there's a real mess in the sport is clearly at the top of the division with Tyson Fury. But beyond that, we're also seeing this issue with those B-rate guys. And when you talk about a guy like Frank Sanchez, he has the talent to be a real problem. However, when you start to look at his CV, it looks pretty bare. Efe Ajagba was a good win back in 2021. Now, Efe was perhaps flattered to be in the top 10 by one of the governing bodies. He was ranked number 8. I would say that Ajagba was somewhat flattered to be in the top 10. I don't think his CV justified that. But nonetheless, officially, he was ranked there. In today's game, though, for instance, you've got guys like David Adelaide, who are ranked in the top 10 by one of the governing bodies. You've got Ivan Ditchko, you've got Ajit Kabayel. So really, you want to apply context when you're considering who's genuinely a B-rate level guy, who's in that second group of fighters just below the elite guys. I don't think Efe Ajagba ever fell into that category of being a top 10 fighter, but nonetheless, officially he was there on paper, and Frank Sanchez did a very good job against him. But that aside, he's not really done anything. He's managed to jump to 4th in the world, despite that being his only victory of note on his CV. And he's not sought to take any risks since then. I mean, to put things into perspective, Daniel Martz, his last opponent, had been knocked out in 4 of his last 6 fights. The fight prior to Sanchez, he fought the British champion in Fabio Wardley, and he got knocked out in 2 rounds. So what is Frank Sanchez doing to try and get himself in the mouths of boxing fans? For boxing fans to say, this guy, you need to stop running from him. Put him in the ring against either Usyk, either Fury, it doesn't matter. He deserves a world title shot. And I know there's a crowd out there that will say, it doesn't matter. He can sit around and he can wait to become mandatory or wait for a final eliminator to be called. He's the 4th in the world and so on and so forth. The problem is this though. When analysts are talking, say, about Tyson Fury and his CV, you'll often hear them say he fought Deontay Wilder 3 times, he fought Vladimir Klitschko. Some of them will say Dillian Whyte, although some people try to eradicate that as an achievement too, even though Dillian Whyte was Ring Magazine's number 5th heavyweight in the world. Here's the thing. When you're talking about Frank Sanchez as being the number 4 in the world, you know who else was number 4 in the world by one of the governing bodies when Tyson Fury fought him? Otto Wallin. The WBA number 4 when he fought Tyson Fury. Frank Sanchez, the WBC number 4. People don't give Tyson Fury credit for Wallin now. So he'll look at this, Tyson, and his team will look at this and they'll say, if I fight Frank Sanchez, and I know there's a risk there, if I beat him, no one's going to give me credit anyway. They're going to say, who did he ever beat? One guy, an Efe Ajagba? This is why a lot of these B-rate fighters need to be able to bypass those excuses that the big champions may be willing to take and to say, I'm going to force myself into position by beating other B-rate level guys. Let us fight each other to see who can go on to face the final boss. And talking of Otto Wallin, the Swedish heavyweight, very good technical southpaw boxer, who has he fought since fighting Tyson Fury? Dominic Brazil, who was well over the hill, but it was a good performance. And then Kamil Sokolovsky, a journeyman. And he did not put in a good performance in that fight. He won very clearly, But he was receiving criticism, and that fight was in front of a British crowd. It was in Wales. Surely you'd want to get yourself back out in the UK, try and rectify your reputation in front of the British fans, because it's an influential fan base. And if they're calling for fights, you're more likely to get an opportunity. But no, we don't see that with Otto Wallin. Now that brings us on to Andy Ruiz and Deontay Wilder. Wilder has inexplicably found himself at number 1 with the WBC, and he's been inactive. He's fought Robert Helenius, a washed up sparring partner, after the obliteration at the hands of Tyson Fury, and he hasn't fought anyone else since. You've had Andy Ruiz, who in 3.5 years since losing to Anthony Joshua has only fought twice, against Chris Arreola in 2021 and Luis Ortiz in 2022. So this is a mess. I mean, it's brilliant if they finally get into the ring and fight each other, but there's no guarantee of that. They're still fighting among themselves when it comes to splits. According to the reports, Andy Ruiz was demanding $20 million to fight Tyson Fury. So how about one of the other purported monsters in the division? Arslanbek Makhmudov, a big physical brute force of nature, the sort of guy that looks like he's a cannibal who hides in the mountains of Russia, and anybody that strays into his territory is waiting to devour them. But despite that, and despite the fact that he's a beast in the ring and very exciting to watch, what is there about his CV that makes him stand out? There are a bunch of recognizable names, guys that were once top fighters like Samuel Peter, Erkan Tepa, who dethroned David Price, Marius Vac. These were world title contenders, but they're shadows of themselves by the time he fought them. The best fighter he's fought is Carlos Takam, and that was a hard fight. And listen, Takam can give a whole bunch of guys hard fights, so there's no criticism there, but at least Carlos Takam, although old, is still of a decent level. Since then, he's fought Michael Wallish and a basketball player in Akpejori. So what is Arslanbek Makhmudov doing to catapult himself into the upper echelons of the sport, apart from sitting there with a high ranking, fighting guys that nobody really knows who they are or their has-beens, and waiting in the hope that he gets a shot? Then let's talk about some other American contenders. Jarrell Miller, this dude has pumped his body with so many substances that his blood is flammable. You could run your diesel car on his blood, but it's so toxic you probably won't be allowed to drive it in a ULEZ zone. And since he's come back, he's had a knockover job, and then he fought a washed up Lucas Brown. So he's hardly putting himself into contention. Then you've got Michael Hunter, a very dangerous guy who I've been raving about for a number of years and saying he could be a real problem for a lot of the bigger, more cumbersome heavyweights. I felt that he beat Alexander Povetkin in that fight. He got a draw. And then he was going to fight Hrgovic. He decided to duck that fight to go another route. He ended up fighting Mike Wilson. He got a draw with Jerry Forrest back in 2021. And since then, he's not fought anybody. And he's been talking about the likes of Martin Bakole ducking him. You've beaten Martin Bakole once in the past. A brilliant win. But if he's going down another route and he's ranked a lot higher than you, as if he's going to look behind him just because you haven't been active so he can fight you. Yeah, maybe he could want to rectify that defeat. But is that what you're gambling on? You need to get out there and be active, Michael Hunter. And talking about Martin Bakole, I've actually got some respect for Martin Bakole, because this Congolese heavyweight that puts his hands together very, very well, picks his shots beautifully, he's actually got a decent CV for the level that he's operated at. Guys like Sergei Kuzmin, that's actually a fight I felt he lost, I'll be honest with you. But Kuzmin was a real nightmare at the amateur level, and he just hasn't done it at the pro game. He's let himself get out of shape. He hasn't lived the life. He's one of those wasted talents, you could argue. That was a risk. He took a risk to fight a guy like Sergei Kuzmin. Because if Kuzmin does decide to take it seriously and turn up, you're potentially having a problem on your hands. Prior to that, if you're going back earlier, he also fought Marius Vac back in 2019. He was a little bit better than he is now, Marius Vac, back then. And again, you're talking about Bakole still building up his career. And more recently, he went to Paris to overcome Tony Yoka, the Olympic gold medalist, in his backyard. So I give major props to Martin Bakole. Him and Billy Nelson have been calling out everyone. He even accosted Dillian Whyte recently. So he's not seeking to bypass the B-rated guys to get to the A-rated guys. He wants to fight some names. So I've got to have some respect for that. However, when you do look at his CV, only Tony Yoka could said to have been a household name in European boxing. We still need to see him get in there against other B-rate guys. So in his case, while I don't blame him, it's still another example of the heavyweight division being a bit of a mess. And that brings us up on to Filip Hrgovic. The big Croatian, highly decorated amateur fighter has announced that he'll be fighting Dempsey McKean. Now, McKean was just in the top 10 of the WBC. He's recently fallen out of it. And while he's undefeated and it looks good on paper, in reality, people are aware that Dempsey McKean is not among the top 10 best heavyweights in the world. This is why when Tyson Fury was talking about fighting McKean, people were up in arms, because you understood this was not the equivalent of fighting a guy the level of Hrgovic. They understand he's probably around the top 20 mark. So prior to that, the name that stands out on Filip Hrgovic's record is Jalolov Zhang. But before that fight, nobody expected Zhang to put up the sort of fight he put up. So that wasn't really a case of Hrgovic taking this massive risk. They saw this guy as a guy who gasses, because his performances up to that point had suggested that. And now that he's old, he's not exactly going to be getting any more stamina. So people saw that as a gimme for Hrgovic. And he had some personal issues and he didn't really turn up in that fight. But that aside, who else is there on the CV? Which takes us on to another decorated amateur heavyweight, Bakole Jalolov, a guy who I believe one day will become the heavyweight champion of the world. I think he's a superb fighter. But there have been a lot of people that have been demanding that Fury fights him instead of Francis Ngannou. But on paper, what has he done from a pro perspective? I know he's been dipping in and out of the amateur scene, and now he's signed with Top Rank, and they're talking about him focusing solely on the pro game, which is great. But if you're talking about his pro record, his best win is another journeyman in Kamil Sokolovsky. I mean, just to put this into perspective, Frazer Clarke beat Sokolovsky, and Frazer Clarke was not recently deemed ready to fight for a British title. His last opponent, Curtis Harper, with a record of 14-7, was the first fight he's had that was scheduled for 10 rounds. If Tyson Fury was to fight somebody like Jalolov and beat him, people will say he was far too green. And yet with the decorated amateur career that he's had, why are they moving him so slowly? This brings me on to Murat Gassiev. He's a bit of a plodder with his feet, but he's a monster puncher. He has wonderful technique, both with the right hand and especially that left hook. It's one of the most beautiful, most devastating punches in boxing. And the fact that he's a plodder has potentially on paper caused him more problems at cruiserweight than at heavyweight. His sole defeat is at the hands of Alexander Usyk. Whereas the heavier you go, the more cumbersome they become. So maybe his plodding feet won't be as much of a problem at heavyweight, and we know his power is going to carry at heavyweight. But then since losing to Alexander Usyk, what have we seen? Since 2020, he's been involved in 4 fights. And I say 4 fights. Nuri Seferi went 1 round. Carlos Welch went 87 seconds. Michael Wallish, he got out there in 4 rounds. And Mike Balogun, who on paper, fair enough, was 20-0. WBA Intercontinental Heavyweight title, but this is an example again of somebody who was ranked higher than their abilities deserve to be ranked. He got him out in 2 rounds. What is Murat Gassiev doing in order to catapult his name into the upper echelons of the sport? Why aren't all these beef range fighters that I'm talking to you about fighting each other? This brings me on to Ivan Ditchko, the Kazakh heavyweight who was a double Olympic bronze medalist and a double silver medalist at the Amateur Worlds. He's 32 years old, no spring chicken, and his last fight was against Bracamonte, a guy who in 2018 was knocked out by Dave Allen. And look at that CV. He's ranked by BoxRec at 49th in the world, and one of the governing bodies has him ranked at top 10. What's going on with that? How is Ivan Ditchko in the top 10 with any governing body? Now, I'm not going to include the likes of Richard Torres and Jared Anderson because I still classify them in the prospect range. But I hope you can see now that this is a top-down problem. It's not just the case of Fury not fighting Usyk. That is the biggest problem, of course, in the division. But even if you start to look towards the B-level guys, they don't seem to want to be fighting other B-level guys in order to get themselves into position. There's been a build-up of traffic, and this is harming the glamour division of the sport of boxing. Let me know what you think, ladies and gents. Please don't forget to hit a stiff jab on the like button, a right cross on the subscribe button, and an uppercut on the notifications button. Thanks for watching. Chat to you soon. Take care. God bless.